Imagine the desert, not the romantic desert of films with its noble dunes and lonely camels. Imagine the Sonoran Desert in Arizona, a place of brutal honesty. The ground is baked clay and rock, cracked like old pottery. The plants that survive are weapons. They have spines, thorns, poisons. The sun is not a life-giving star. It is an anvil. In July, it hammers the land with 115-degree heat, turning the air into a physical weight. For a century, modern agriculture has tried to conquer this land. It has used brute force. It has drilled 1,000 feet into the earth, pumping out fossil water that will never be replaced. It has diverted entire rivers, like the mighty Colorado, bleeding them dry to grow thirsty crops like cotton and alfalfa. It has thrown mountains of chemical fertilizers at the sterile ground, hoping to shock it into fertility. This is the story of a war between man and nature. And for 100 years, man was losing. The water tables were dropping. The rivers were shrinking. The soil was turning saline, poisoned by the very salts the irrigation water left behind. The desert was winning. It always wins. Then, in 1991, a man arrived who decided not to fight. He was a refugee from Cuba. His name was Lázaro Pérez. He had no money. He had no formal education in agronomy. He spoke broken English. He leased a few acres of the worst land imaginable. Land that seasoned fourth-generation Arizona farmers had declared God's anvil, utterly worthless. And on this anvil he began to plant garbage. Literally. His neighbors watched him, first with curiosity, then with derision. They saw him driving his rusted pickup truck, collecting spoiled vegetables from grocery stores, coffee grounds from restaurants, grass clippings from suburban lawns. They watched him dig long, shallow trenches and fill them with this organic waste. They laughed. The crazy Cuban is planting trash. They had no idea they were watching a revolution. They had no idea that this quiet man, with dirt under his fingernails and sadness in his eyes, was about to solve a problem that million-dollar university studies and corporate research labs had failed to crack. This is not just the story of a farm. This is the story of a different kind of genius. The story of how wisdom can be more powerful than technology, how memory can be more fertile than soil, and how one man's vision, born in the scarcity of communist Cuba, blossomed into an impossible abundance in the heart of the American desert. This is the story of Verde Milagro, the green miracle. To understand what Lázaro Pérez accomplished, you must first understand the world he entered. Arizona in the early 1990s was a state living on borrowed time. Its entire civilization, its sprawling cities of Phoenix and Tucson, its green golf courses, its swimming pools shimmering under the sun, was an illusion. An oasis built on the unsustainable siphoning of the Colorado River. The Central Arizona Project, a monumental feat of engineering, was complete. A 336-mile-long aqueduct, a concrete artery pumping lifeblood from the river into the desert. But everyone knew it was a temporary fix. The river was already over-allocated. The states that depended on it were already fighting over scraps. Agriculture was the state's original sin. It consumed over 70% of the water. And for what? To grow low-value, high-thirst crops like cotton and alfalfa, which were then shipped overseas. It was economic madness. It was ecological suicide. The University of Arizona, a world-class institution for arid land studies, was desperately searching for a solution. Their laboratories were filled with brilliant minds. They experimented with hydroponics, growing plants in nutrient-rich water. But it was expensive, complex, and energy-intensive, not a solution for feeding millions. They experimented with genetically modified crops, trying to engineer plants that could withstand the heat and salt. Progress was slow, and the results were marginal. They looked at desalination, the dream of turning ocean water into fresh water. The cost was astronomical. The energy required was immense. It was not a viable answer for a landlocked state. The establishment, the entire edifice of modern scientific agriculture, was hitting a wall. Their approach was rooted in a specific philosophy: domination. They saw the desert as an enemy to be subdued, a problem to be solved with more power, more concrete, more chemicals, more technology. They were trying to force the desert to become Iowa. The desert refused. Into this impasse walked Lazaro Perez. He was born in 1950, not in the bustling city of Havana, but in the countryside of the Pinar del Rio province, a region of red earth and tobacco fields. His family was not wealthy. They were not landowners. They were simply people of the land. He was not a good student in the traditional sense. The classrooms of the Revolution, with their rigid doctrines and rote memorization, bored him. His mind was elsewhere. It was in the dirt. While other boys his age were memorizing speeches by Fidel, Lazaro was watching ants. He was watching how they built their colonies, how they managed resources, how they created complex, sustainable systems in a world of constant challenge. He was watching the way certain weeds grew in the cracks of sun-baked pavement, thriving where carefully tended garden plants withered. His grandmother was his first teacher. She wasn't a scientist. She was a survivor. She practiced a form of agriculture born of centuries of scarcity. She wasted nothing. She taught him how to read the soil, not with a chemical test kit, but with his hands. She taught him how to predict rain not from a weather report, but from the behavior of birds and the smell of the air. She taught him that the best fertilizer was not bought in a bag, but created from the scraps of the kitchen and the waste of the animals. These were not formal lessons. They were absorbed. They became part of his DNA. Then came the special period in Cuba after the fall of the Soviet Union. The country's economy collapsed. Food and fuel disappeared. It was a time of desperate hunger. And something extraordinary happened. The Cuban people, out of sheer necessity, created one of the largest movements in sustainable urban agriculture the world has ever seen. They called them organoponicos. They turned vacant lots, rooftops, and balconies into vibrant gardens. They used the same principles Lazaro's grandmother had practiced. They built raised beds and filled them with composted organic matter. They used natural pest control. They conserved every drop of water. Lazaro was not just a witness to this. He was a participant. He saw a nation, cut off from the world, learn to feed itself with nothing but ingenuity and a deep understanding of natural systems. He learned the most important lesson of his life. Scarcity is the mother of wisdom. In 1991, disillusioned and seeking freedom, he made the perilous journey to the United States. He eventually found his way to Arizona, where a small community of Cuban exiles had settled, and he saw the desert. For the first time, he saw the Sonoran Desert. Most refugees arriving in this alien landscape would have felt despair. The heat, the emptiness, the hostility of the environment. It was the polar opposite of the lush green island he had left behind. But Lazaro felt something else. He felt a strange sense of recognition. He saw the relentless sun, and he didn't see an enemy. He saw an engine, an incredible source of free energy. He saw the nutrient-poor soil, and he didn't see a sterile wasteland. He saw a blank canvas, an opportunity to build a new soil from the ground up, exactly the way he wanted it. He saw the scarcity of water, and he did not despair. He saw a challenge he had been preparing for his entire life. At the age of 41, standing on a dusty patch of Arizona dirt, Lazaro Perez found his true calling. He would not just survive in this desert, he would make it bloom. The problem of desert agriculture is brutally complex. Think of it like trying to raise a baby in the middle of a battlefield. First, there is water, or the lack of it. Every drop you put on the ground is immediately attacked. The sun tries to evaporate it from above. The dry, sandy soil tries to drain it away from below. Most irrigation in Arizona was and is shockingly inefficient. As much as 50% of the water is lost before a plant's roots can even touch it. Second, the heat. The sun doesn't just warm the plants, it cooks them. It scorches their leaves, stresses their systems, and forces them to consume even more water just to stay alive. Third, the soil. It is not soil in the way a farmer from Ohio would understand it. It is decomposed rock and sand. It has almost no organic matter, no life. It cannot hold water. It cannot provide nutrients. It is a sterile medium. To make it fertile, industrial farms carpet bomb it with synthetic nitrogen and phosphorus. Fourth, and most insidiously, salt. All water, even fresh water from a river, contains dissolved salts. When you pour that water on a field in a dry climate, the water evaporates, but the salt stays behind. Year after year, the salt accumulates in the topsoil. It builds up until the soil becomes toxic, and nothing can grow. This process, called salinization, has destroyed entire agricultural civilizations throughout history. This was the four-headed monster Lazaro had to defeat. And he had no weapons, no money for fancy irrigation systems, no access to chemical fertilizers, no budget for expensive shade cloth. He had only memory and garbage. His solution was not an invention. It was an ecosystem. He called it simply sombra y suelo, shade and soil. His first step was to address the sun. He needed shade. But instead of buying expensive materials, he planted it. He went to a local nursery and bought seedlings of the most common, hardy, and despised trees in the desert: mesquite and palo verde. These trees are masters of survival. They have deep taproots to find water, and they are perfectly adapted to the heat. His farmer neighbors thought he was insane. Why would you plant weeds in your field? Lazaro planted them in long, straight rows, spaced about 40 feet apart. Next, the soil. Between the rows of newly planted trees, he dug his trenches. They were about 3 feet wide and 2 feet deep. This was the back-breaking work. He did it by hand, with a pickaxe and shovel under the unforgiving sun. Then, he started collecting his garbage. He made arrangements with local grocery stores to take their unsellable produce. He went to restaurants for their coffee grounds and vegetable scraps. He went to landscaping companies for their lawn clippings and wood chips. He layered all of this organic material into his trenches. A layer of vegetable waste, then a layer of wood chips, then a layer of manure he got from a local stable. He was building a giant subterranean compost pile, a lasagna of life. This was the core of his organoponico memory from Cuba, adapted for the vastness of the Arizona desert. This compost-filled trench did 3 things simultaneously. 1. As it decomposed, it generated a rich, black, nutrient-dense humus, a perfect soil teeming with microbial life. It was a self-fertilizing system. 2. This organic matter acted like a sponge. It could hold incredible amounts of water, releasing it slowly to the plant's roots. It solved the problem of drainage and dramatically reduced the need for frequent watering. 3. The slow decomposition generated a small amount of heat, which during the cooler desert nights kept the root zone of the plants warm and stable. Finally, water. He couldn't afford a computerized drip system, so he built his own. He bought cheap black poly tubing and a simple hole punch. He laid the tubing down the center of his compost trenches and punched tiny holes exactly where he would plant his crops. The true genius was not the system itself, but the timing. He watered only once a day, in the pre-dawn darkness, between 4 and 5 a.m. Why? Because at that hour, the sun was down, the air was at its coolest, and the wind was at its calmest. Evaporation was near zero. Almost every single drop of water he used went directly into the soil sponge and was held there. The system was complete. A symphony of simple solutions. The trees would grow, providing dappled shade to protect the crops from the harshest afternoon sun. Their leaves and seed pods would drop, adding more organic matter to the soil. The compost trenches would feed the crops and hold the water. The low-tech drip system would deliver that water with unparalleled efficiency. It was a closed loop, a self-sustaining oasis in miniature. In the spring of 1992, he planted his first crops in the trenches: tomatoes, peppers, squash, basil. The neighboring farmers watched, waiting for the inevitable failure. The summer heat arrived like a physical blow. Temperatures soared, the air shimmered. Their own crops of cotton and alfalfa were struggling, sucking down thousands of gallons of water per acre every single day. But in Lazaro's field, something impossible was happening. The young mesquite trees were providing just enough shade. The thick layer of mulch on top of the trenches was preventing the soil from baking. And beneath the surface, in that rich, dark, moist humus, the roots of his vegetables were thriving. In July, when other fields were scorched and stressed, Lazaro's plot was an explosion of green. He began to harvest. The tomatoes were not mealy and flavorless. They were deep red, heavy, and bursting with a sweetness that only comes from healthy, living soil. The basil was so fragrant you could smell it from 100 feet away. He loaded the produce into his old truck and drove to the farmer's market in Scottsdale. He laid his vegetables out on a simple folding table. At first, people walked by. His setup was humble. But then, a chef from a high-end restaurant stopped. He picked up a tomato. He smelled it. His eyes widened. He tasted a basil leaf. He bought everything Lazaro had. And he asked a question that would change Lazaro's life. Where can I get more of this? The first harvest was a validation. It was proof. The system worked. The chef became his first regular customer. Soon, other chefs followed. The word began to spread through the tight-knit culinary community of Phoenix and Scottsdale. There was a man, a Cuban, growing impossible vegetables in the desert. A reporter from the Arizona Republic wrote a small feature story. It was titled, "The Miracle in Maricopa." That article found its way to the desk of Dr. Samuel Gaines, a professor of soil science at the University of Arizona. Gaines was a man who had spent 30 years studying the limitations of desert soil. He was skeptical. The claims in the article sounded too good to be true. He drove out to Lazaro's farm expecting to find a fluke or a misunderstanding. He found a revolution. He walked between the rows. He saw the vibrant health of the plants. He felt the soil in the trenches, dark, moist, and cool to the touch, even in the middle of the day. He saw the simple, efficient irrigation. He talked to Lazaro, who explained his philosophy not in scientific terms, but in the language of a poet and a peasant. "You don't fight the sun," Lazaro told him. "You dance with it." Gaines took soil samples. He took water meter readings. He returned to his lab and ran the data. The results were staggering. Lazaro's soil had an organic matter content of over 15%. The surrounding desert soil had less than 1%. His water usage per pound of produce harvested was 90% lower than the state average for commercial vegetable farming. 90%. And because he was building soil instead of depleting it, there was no salt buildup. His farm was not just sustainable, it was regenerative. It was getting better every year. Dr. Gaines presented his findings at a university conference. He called Lazaro's method the single most promising breakthrough in arid land agriculture I have witnessed in my career. Lazaro Perez was no longer the crazy Cuban. He was a visionary. With this academic validation, investment came, not from venture capitalists, but from local restaurateurs and organic food advocates who saw the future in what he was doing. He leased more land, 10 acres, then 50, then 200. He hired other immigrants, many of them refugees like himself, and taught them his system. He named his farm Verde Milagro. By 1998, Verde Milagro was a thriving multi-million-dollar enterprise. Its produce was in every Whole Foods in the state. It was the signature ingredient for dozens of the best restaurants. The farm was a beautiful, chaotic, productive oasis, rows of shady mesquite trees, and in between them, a riot of heirloom tomatoes, exotic herbs, sweet melons, and vibrant peppers. It was feeding, by a conservative estimate, over 1 million people a year. It was an absolute triumph, a testament to one man's resilience and wisdom. But Lazaro didn't know that his real battle, the harder battle, was just beginning. He had conquered the desert. He had defeated the laws of physics. Now he had to face something far more ruthless: the laws of economics. Lazaro proved the desert could be beaten. He built a green paradise from nothing. But now he faced a new enemy: the system itself. Before we continue, I want to ask you, what do you think is a greater obstacle for an innovator? The laws of nature or the rules of man? Let me know in the comments. I read them all very carefully. And if you're finding this story of resilience inspiring, please take a moment to hit that like button. It tells the algorithm that stories of human ingenuity matter. Now, let's continue. The first attack came from the giants. The massive agricultural corporations that dominated the American food system saw Verde Milagro not as an inspiration, but as a threat. They couldn't replicate his model. Their entire business was built on scale, mechanization, and chemical inputs. Lazaro's system required observation, care, and a human touch. It was fundamentally incompatible with their worldview, so they sought to crush him. They used their immense power to lobby for water policies that favored their massive, water-intensive operations. They flooded the market with cheap, mass-produced tomatoes and peppers from Mexico, grown with cheap labor and subsidized water. They could not compete with Lazaro on quality, so they decided to destroy him on price. Suddenly, his restaurant clients, while still loving his product, were under pressure to lower their costs. Some had to switch to the cheaper, inferior produce. The second blow came from progress. Phoenix was one of the fastest-growing cities in America. The urban sprawl was relentless. The worthless desert land that Lazaro had leased for pennies on the dollar was now on the edge of new suburban developments. His landlords were getting offers from housing developers that were astronomical. An acre of farmland might generate a few $1,000s a year in profit. That same acre, sold for a housing tract, was worth $1 million. The pressure was immense. His leases were not renewed. He was forced to move his operation further and further out into the desert, away from his customer base, where the land was still cheap. But this increased his transportation costs and logistical complexity. The third enemy was bureaucracy. As Verde Milagro grew, it attracted the attention of regulators, food safety inspectors, water management authorities, labor officials. They descended on the farm, armed with rule books written for industrial monoculture. They didn't understand his compost trenches. They saw them as unregulated waste disposal. They didn't understand his integrated system of trees and crops. They saw it as messy and inefficient. They tried to force him to conform to a model that would have destroyed the very essence of his innovation. Lazaro, the man who had orchestrated a symphony with nature, found himself drowning in a sea of paperwork, permits, and legal challenges. He was not a businessman. He was not a lawyer. He was a farmer, a gardener. His genius was in the soil, not in the boardroom. And it was during this period of struggle that the true character of the man was revealed. Lazaro was much more than an inventor. He was a teacher. He never patented his sombra y suelo method. When asked why, his answer was simple. "The knowledge does not belong to me," he would say. "It belongs to the earth. I just listened." He opened his farm every weekend to the public. He gave free workshops. He taught community college classes. He shared his methods with anyone who would listen. Backyard gardeners, other small farmers, university students. He believed his greatest legacy would not be the farm itself, but the dissemination of the idea. His patriotism was not for a flag, but for the land. He had come from a country, Cuba, where the land had been abused by foreign corporations and then by a totalitarian state. He saw America as a place of immense opportunity, but he also saw it making the same mistakes, consuming its natural capital, its soil and water, for short-term gain. He wanted to show his new country a better way. By the early 2000s, the fight became too much. The combination of corporate price wars, urban sprawl, and regulatory burdens was a hydra with too many heads. Verde Milagro, the large-scale commercial farm, ceased operations. To the outside world, it looked like a failure. The giants had won. The crazy Cuban's miracle had run its course. But that was not the end of the story. Lazaro did not surrender. He adapted. He sold off the last of his large leases and equipment. With the money, he bought a small 10-acre plot of land far out in the desert, a piece of land that no developer would want for 50 years. And on this small plot, he built his final masterpiece. It was not a commercial farm. It was the Perez Center for Arid Land Wisdom, a nonprofit research and education farm. He rebuilt his ecosystem in miniature: the shady mesquite trees, the rich compost trenches, the hyper-efficient watering system. Here, free from the pressures of the market, he refined his methods. He experimented with new crops. He taught his workshops. He spent the last decade of his life doing what he loved most, walking his rows, his hands in the living soil he had created, sharing his knowledge with a new generation. He passed away peacefully in 2011 at the age of 61, a quiet end for a man who had started a quiet revolution. So, what is the moral of this story? If you measure success by quarterly earnings and market share, then Lazaro Perez failed. He was a brief, brilliant flash in the pan, ultimately extinguished by the unyielding forces of the modern economy. But that is a profound misreading of his legacy. Lazaro's victory was not commercial. It was philosophical. He was not trying to build a corporation. He was trying to prove a point. And he proved it beyond any doubt. He demonstrated that the problem of feeding humanity in a warming, drying world is not necessarily a problem of technology. It is a problem of imagination. He proved that the answers we seek are often not in the future, but in the past. In the forgotten wisdom of our ancestors, in the careful observation of natural systems. He showed that we can work with nature, not just against it. That we can build soil, not just deplete it. That we can create abundance in the most unlikely of places. Today, the state of Arizona is in a deeper water crisis than ever before. The levels in Lake Mead and Lake Powell, the great reservoirs of the Colorado River, are at historic lows. The state is implementing drastic cuts to agriculture. The very system that crushed Lázaro Pérez is now collapsing under the weight of its own unsustainability. And the answer is still there, in the desert, for anyone willing to see it. The thousands of people Lázaro taught, the students who visited his farm, the gardeners who use his methods, they are the seeds of his true legacy. His ideas are alive in community gardens in Phoenix, in small-scale organic farms in New Mexico, in development projects in Africa and India. The knowledge, as he intended, belongs to the world. Every time a scientist says we need a new billion-dollar technological fix to solve our food crisis, the ghost of Lázaro Pérez stands as a quiet rebuttal. Every time someone claims that sustainable, regenerative agriculture cannot be scaled, the memory of Verde Milagro, which once fed millions, proves them wrong. He left us not a company, but a blueprint. He left us not a patent, but a paradigm. Lázaro Pérez. He arrived in a wasteland with nothing but memory, and he left behind a guide for our survival.